All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. We're continuing the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 3, written by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're still on the first chapter, entitled Swami Invites the Hippies. So the title of this chapter is coming from a newspaper article that was written about Srila Prabhupada when he arrived at Haight-Ashbury to open the second temple on Frederick Street in San Francisco. The 6 devotees who went there to open the temple, that was Mukunda and Janaki's sister Joan, and her associate Roger Siegel, who later became Guru Das, and their friend Sam, who later became Shyam Sundar, and his wife Melanie, who later became Malati, different flower names, Madhavi, Malati. So the 6 of them together, they found the storefront, and then they got this wonderful idea to have the mantra rock dance concert to introduce Srila Prabhupada to all of the hippies. And it was so successful, over 3,000 people came to the concert, and we're going to hear tonight about that concert and the aftermaths of it. The conversation, right now this is a conversation that Hayagriva was having with Allen Ginsberg. So Allen Ginsberg had already introduced the chanting of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra to the youth of America. He had gone to India, and while in Calcutta, he had heard one woman saint chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, and he became completely mystified by it. He brought that mantra back to America, and wherever he was having his be-ins, his poetry readings, and any group that he was invited to speak at, he would begin with the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. He had a small harmonium that he would bring. He only knew one tune. So Allen Ginsberg had also been in San Francisco at that time for the gathering of the tribes, when 20,000 hippies all came together on Hippie Hill in Golden Gate Park, and he led the chanting of Hare Krishna there. Now Allen Ginsberg was going to help Prabhupada with this concert. And Hayagriva, who was trying to convince Allen Ginsberg to maybe change his tune to something more traditional, like what the tunes Prabhupada was singing. So we're going on now with this conversation. The conversation turned to the upcoming program at the Avalon Ballroom. Don't you think there's a possibility of chanting a tune that would be more appealing to Western ears? Allen asked. So Hayagriva was objecting to Allen's tune. Allen was objecting to Prabhupada's tunes. Any tune will do, said Prabhupada. Melody is not important. What is important is that you will chant Hare Krishna. It can be in the tune of your own country. That doesn't matter. So later, the devotees, when they started going out on Sankirtan regularly, they started to make it more like a musical concert. They had many musical instruments, and they had choreographed dancing. And Prabhupada wasn't interested in that. Actually, he said the only thing that was required is the mridanga and the kartals, because he said that the harmonium would make the kirtans drag. So even when Prabhupada was leading his Jai Radha Madhava and things like that, we just had the kartals and the mridanga during kirtans. And for bhajans, there was the harmonium. But Prabhupada, he was very liberal He was very merciful. He did allow the devotees to use their own musical instruments. They would play with their guitars and their drum sets and all of these different things, because what was important was the chanting of Hare Krishna, not necessarily the melody. Prabhupada and Alan also talked about the meaning of the word hippie, and Alan mentioned something about taking LSD. Prabhupada replied that LSD created dependence and was not necessary for a person in Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness resolves everything, Prabhupada said. Nothing else is needed. Now we have an excerpt here from the Time magazine, which is one of the most popular circulated magazines in the world. A July 1967 Time magazine study on hippie philosophy credited the foundation of the hippie movement with historical precedent as far back as the sadhu of India, the spiritual seekers who had renounced the world and materialistic pursuits by taking sannyas. Hippies rejected established institutions, criticized middle-class values, opposed nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War, embraced aspects of Eastern philosophy, championed sexual liberation. That didn't quite fit into the sadhu and sannyas life, but many of the other principles did, were often vegetarian and eco-friendly, promoted the use of psychedelic drugs, which they believed expanded one's consciousness, and created international communities or communes. So even the Time magazine, through their research, they saw a relationship or a correlation between the sadhus of India and this new hippie revolution that was going on now in America and around the world. Many of their concepts of rejecting middle class, how do they call it? Middle class values and the objection to war and vegetarianism, they saw that as coming from the sadhu elements in India. At the Mantra Rock dance, there would be a multimedia light show by the biggest names in the art, Ben van Meter and Roger Hilliard. Ben and Roger were expert at using simultaneous strobe lights, films, and slideshows to fill an auditorium with optical effects reminiscent of LSD visions. Mukunda had given them many slides of Krishna to use during the Kirtan. One evening, Ben and Roger came to see Swamiji in his apartment. So you can imagine a huge room, big enough to fit 3,000 people, completely black. And then from the control room, they have all types of blinking colored lights bouncing against the wall, the ceiling, the people, moving everywhere, and whatever the music rhythm is, the lights would go along with it, and it would create quite an effect, especially when people were intoxicated in the room. You can imagine 3,000 intoxicated people with this whole light show going on. So before the concert, the two light show experts came to meet Srila Prabhupada and talk to him about what he wanted. Roger Hilliard, he was one of the experts, talking about Prabhupada. He was great. I was really impressed. It wasn't the way he looked, the way he acted, or the way he dressed, but it was his total being. Swamiji was very serene and very humorous, and at the same time, obviously very wise and in tune, enlightened. He had the ability to relate to a lot of different kinds of people. you can imagine Srila Prabhupada, a Sanskrit scholar coming from his background in India, now in the midst of thousands upon thousands of hippies who were completely not following the four regulative principles. And there was Prabhupada, very peaceful, trying to turn them all into Vaishnavas. He had the ability to relate to a lot of different kinds of people. I was thinking, some of this must be really strange for this person to come to the United States and end up in the middle of Haight-Ashbury with a storefront for an ashram and a lot of very strange people around. And yet he was totally right there with everybody. So Mukunda, in his book, he was describing that he was collecting the tickets at the front outside of the gate, and the line of people was going all the way around the block. You can imagine 3,000 people in a line. So he was taking $2.50 from every person, and then some other devotees, Malati and others, they came to take over for him because he had to go and make sure that everything was going to work together. So he went upstairs to see Roger and, what was the name of the other person? Ben, who were going to oversee the lighting. And they said to him, "Here, we made this really nice tea. You look like you need to be relaxed. We want you to drink some." So Mukunda said, no, I don't want to drink any tea. We don't drink tea. He said, no, we want you to drink this. So just to satisfy them, he drank it, and there was acid in there. There was LSD in there. And so through the whole concert, Mukunda and all the other devotees, they were given this drink to drink. They all had consumed acid without their knowing it. And they had to function while being intoxicated by this very strong intoxicant. On the night of the mantra rock dance, while the stage crew set up equipment and tested the sound system, and Ben and Roger organized their light shows upstairs, Mukunda and others collected tickets at the door. People lined up all the way down the street and around the block, waiting for tickets at $2.50 apiece. Attendance would be good, a capacity crowd, and most of the local luminaries were coming. That means all of the big stars amongst the hippie community. Now, the owner of the ballroom, because it was on a Sunday night, he thought it wasn't going to be successful. But they had done so much advertising, going on Sankirtan, putting up posters everywhere, that it was a full house, and people had to wait outside for other people to come out before they could get in. LSD pioneer Timothy Leary arrived and was given a special seat on stage. Swami Kriyananda came carrying a tambura. So Timothy Leary, he had been a psychology professor at Harvard University, and he was experimenting on different drugs or chemicals that would help people with psychological problems become cured. And that was how LSD entered into society. From his experiments, he was experimenting on people in prisons and in hospitals, mental hospitals, but he was taking this chemical, giving it to his friends and to his colleagues, and that way it got spread all over the country and eventually all over the world. So Timothy Leary, he was called the high priest of the hippies, because it was he who introduced LSD. And then Swami Kriyananda, he had taken initiation from Paramahansa Yogananda. And he had come back to America in the garb of a sannyasi, and he was teaching the philosophy of Paramahansa Yogananda, and he also came. So because he was very famous as a yoga teacher, he was invited on stage and he brought his tambura with him. He was going to play that. And Timothy Leary was also invited up on stage. It was a big stage. A man wearing a top hat and a suit with a silk sash like this that said San Francisco arrived, claiming to be the mayor. At the door, Mukunda stopped so all kinds of strange people also came as well. So at the door, Mukunda stopped a respectably dressed young man who didn't have a ticket. But then someone tapped Mukunda on the shoulder. "Let him in, it's all right. He's Owsley." So we'll find out who Mr. Owsley is. Mukunda apologized and submitted, allowing Augustus Owsley Stanley II, folk hero and famous synthesizer of LSD, to enter without a ticket. So this is one article, it's probably from the Times, called God's Secret Agent. And this is it's written by Timothy Leary, the Harvard professor, about Mr. Owsley. So Mr. Owsley, he was a sound manager and he also was a chemist. And he learned how to synthesize this acid called LSD. And in his little workrooms, he would create millions and millions of little tabs. LSD was just a drop of a chemical that would be put onto a small little piece of paper this big with one drop. And that one drop of the chemical, when you put the paper into your mouth, you would become intoxicated by it. And he produced over 500 million of those doses of LSD that was distributed all over to these young people. So he was considered one of the highest amongst all of the hippie echelon because of his producing LSD. And he was called God's secret agent because many of these hippies were using LSD for so-called spiritual and mystical experiences. Now we have another group that came to the concert. These are called the Hells Angels. It's a motorcycle group. Almost everyone who came wore bright or unusual costumes, tribal robes, Mexican ponchos, Indian kurtas, God's eyes. God's eyes are, you see the picture of, that's what a God's eye looks like. It's woven on two sticks, you put them together and you weave these God's eyes. Feathers and beads. Some hippies brought their own flutes, lutes, gourds, drums, rattles, horns, and guitars. The Hells Angels, dirty-haired, wearing jeans, boots, and denim jackets, and accompanied by their women, maybe you can't see them in this picture, they would sit on the back of their motorcycles, made their entrance, carrying chains, smoking cigarettes, and displaying their regalia of German helmets, emblazoned emblems, and so on. Everything but their motorcycles, which they had parked outside. So they also came to the concert. The Hells Angels, this is a little description of what the Hells Angels are, because they were just in the same neighborhood as our temple, and there would be run-ins with them. The Hells Angels have a history of involvement in organized crime, drug trafficking, and engaging in violent conflict with other outlaw motorcycle clubs. Involvement in organized crime and violence has historically extended to the organization's most senior leadership, means the more involved you are in crime and violence, the higher you are in the leadership. Most countries consider the clubs an organized crime syndicate, but they came to chant Hare Krishna that night. The devotees began a warm-up kirtan on stage, dancing the way Swamiji had shown them. Incense poured from the stage and from the corners of the large ballroom. Prabhupada had not yet arrived. And although most of the audience were high on drugs, the atmosphere was calm. They had come seeking a spiritual experience. As the chanting began very melodiously, some of the musicians, because there were other music groups that were going to be performing after Prabhupada was chanting Hare Krishna, they were also there. So they took up part by playing their instruments along with the chanting of Hare Krishna. The light show began. Strobe lights flashed. Colored balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the music. Large blobs of pulsing color splurted across the floor, walls, and ceilings. You can see the size of their amplifiers. It was a real experience for the senses. A little after 8 o'clock, this is the name of one of the music groups called Moby Grape, took the stage. With heavy electric guitars, electric bass, and 2 drummers, they launched into their first number. The large speakers shook the ballroom with their vibrations, and a roar of approval rose from the audience. Around 9:30, Prabhupada left his Frederick Street apartment and got into the back seat of Harvey's Cadillac. He was dressed in his usual saffron robes, and around his neck he wore a garland of gardenias. That's Rajnigandha. It's very fragrant. In America, one flower, the white Rajnigandha, cost $5. So expensive. And they would make these beautiful garlands for Prabhupada out of the Rajnigandha. Gandharaj, that's what it is. Big white flowers. They grow in Bengal. So they made that kind of a garland for Prabhupada that night, whose sweet aroma filled the car. On the way to the Avalon, he talked about the need to open more centers. So Srila Prabhupada, he was about to chant with 3,000 people, and already he had come to open his second temple. He was talking about opening up more temples on the way for this big program. At 10 o'clock, Prabhupada walked up the stairs of the Avalon, followed by Kirtanananda and Ranchor. As he entered the ballroom, devotees blew conch shells. Someone began a drum roll, and the crowd parted down the center. All the way from the entrance to the stage, they made room for Prabhupada to walk, opening a path for him to walk. With his head held high, Prabhupada seemed to float by as he walked through the strange milieu, making his way across the ballroom floor to the stage. So some of the people were standing, some were sitting. It was a huge ballroom. It's a place where people come to dance and where musicians play the music and then people dance. And then they parted, made a big walkway so that Prabhupada could come straight up onto the stage. Suddenly the light show changed. Pictures of Krishna and his pastimes flashed onto the wall. Krishna and Arjun riding together on Arjun's chariot. Krishna eating butter. Krishna subduing the whirlwind demon. Krishna playing the flute. As Prabhupada walked through the crowd, everyone stood, applauding and cheering. He climbed the stairs and seated himself softly on a waiting cushion. The crowd quieted. Looking over at Allen Ginsberg, Prabhupada said, You can speak something about the mantra. Alan began to tell of his understanding and experience with the Hare Krishna mantra. He told how Swamiji had opened a storefront on 2nd Avenue in New York City and had chanted Hare Krishna in Tompkins Square Park. And he invited everyone to the Frederick Street Temple. So this is Allen Ginsberg giving his advice to the hippies. I especially recommend the early morning kirtans, he said, for those who, coming down from LSD, want to stabilize their consciousness on re-entry. So all these people who, especially this night, who were intoxicated on LSD, let's say the intoxication will last for 8 hours. So by morning time, the intoxication wears off, and then they have to face the reality of the world that they actually live in. So Allen Ginsberg was recommending all of these souls that by morning time, when their LSD trip was over, they should go to the temple and come down to the world again by chanting Hare Krishna with the devotees. Prabhupada spoke, giving a brief history of the mantra. Then he looked over at Alan again. You may chant. This is, see his small harmonium there in his lap. Alan began playing his harmonium and chanting into the microphone, singing the tune he had brought from India. Gradually, more and more people in the audience caught on and began chanting. As the kirtan continued and the audience got increasingly enthusiastic, musicians from the various bands came on stage to join in. Ranchor, a fair drummer, began playing Moby Grape's drums. Some of the bass and other guitar players joined in as the devotees and a large group of hippies mounted the stage. So normally, if you're in a ballroom, which is what this is, you have the musicians on the stage and the people dancing in the room. But this was a different experience. Everyone was dancing, everyone was singing. There was no difference between the people on the stage and the 3,000 people in the ballroom. They were all together in this experience. The multicolored oil slicks pulsed, and the balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the mantra, now projected onto the wall. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. As the chanting spread throughout the hall, some of the hippies got to their feet, held hands, and danced. Allen Ginsberg. We sang Hare Krishna all evening. It was absolutely great, an open thing. It was the height of the Haight-Ashbury spiritual enthusiasm. It was the first time that there had been a music scene in San Francisco where everybody could be part of it and participate. Everybody could sing and dance rather than listen to other people sing and dance. So even Allen Ginsberg understood that this was breaking all barriers because everyone in Kirtan takes part. There might be one person leading, but everyone, this is Sankirtan. That's what Sankirtan really means. And here Prabhupada was leading 3,000 people in chanting Hare Krishna. They had no idea what they were doing, but the potency of the transcendental sound vibrations of chanting Hare Krishna was automatically purifying the entire audience. Janaki. People didn't know what they were chanting for. But to see that many people chanting, even though most of them were intoxicated, made Swamiji very happy. He loved to see the people chanting. Hayagriva. Standing in front of the bands, I could hardly hear. It was so loud. But above all, I could make out the chanting of Hare Krishna building steadily. On the wall behind, a slide projected a huge picture of Krishna in a golden helmet with a peacock feather, a flute in his hand. So now since Mukunda had given them many pictures of Krishna and the Hare Krishna mantra, that was replacing and going along with the whole light show, so the people could see the words of the Hare Krishna mantra, and they could all see pictures of Krishna as well as they were chanting. Then Srila Prabhupada stood up, lifted his arms, and began to dance. He gestured for everybody to join him, and those who were still seated stood up and began dancing and chanting and swaying back and forth, following Prabhupada's gentle dance. Roger Siegel. The ballroom appeared as if it was a human field of wheat blowing in the wind. It produced a calm feeling in contrast to the Avalon ballroom atmosphere of gyrating energies. The chanting of Hare Krishna continued for over 1 hour, and finally everyone was jumping and yelling, even crying and shouting, chanting Hare Krishna. Someone placed a microphone before Srila Prabhupada, and his voice resounded strongly over the powerful sound system. The tempo quickened. Srila Prabhupada was perspiring profusely. Kirtananda insisted that the kirtan stop. No way. Kirtan wasn't going to stop. Swamiji was too old for this, he said. It might be harmful. But the chanting continued, faster and faster, until the words of the mantra finally became indistinguishable amidst the amplified music and the chorus of thousands of voices. So Prabhupada really got that whole group chanting and dancing and crying, and Prabhupada was leading the kirtan by that time. It was just an amazing experience for everybody. Then suddenly it ended, and all that could be heard was the loud hum of the amplifiers and Srila Prabhupada's voice ringing out, offering obeisances to his spiritual master. Om Vishnu Pad Paramhansa Paribrajacharya Astotara Sata Shishi Mad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Can you imagine? All glories to the assembled devotees. So Prabhupada did not compromise. Even after such an amazing kirtan, he ended the same way he always ended, by glorifying his spiritual master. See the dedication that Srila Prabhupada had to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. All of the efforts he took to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna all over the world. Srila Prabhupada made his way off stage through the heavy smoke and crowds and down the front stairs with Kirtananda and Ranchor close behind him. Alan announced the next rock group. So now the chanting was over. They accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. They got everyone to chant Hare Krishna. Now for the rest of the night, it was about 10 o'clock by then, they were going to have all the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin. They were all going to be performing for the rest of the night. As Swamiji left the ballroom and the appreciative crowd behind, he commented, "This is no place for a brahmachari." The next morning, the temple was crowded with young people who had seen Swamiji at the Avalon. Most of them had stayed up all night. Srila Prabhupada, having followed his usual morning schedule, came down at 7, held kirtan, and delivered the morning lecture. So we heard last week that in the article that Shankarshan Prabhu had collected all of the quotes that Prabhupada gave, he said that these hippies, most of the leaders in our movement at that time came from these hippie groups. And now, after chanting Hare Krishna at the Avalon, they came to the temple. Gradually, they became purified, and they gave up their sinful activities, and they became devotees, not ordinary devotees, but the devotees who led our movement in those days and carried Krishna consciousness all over the world. Later that morning, while riding to the beach with Kirtanananda and Hayagriva, Swamiji asked how many people had attended last night's kirtan. When they told him, he asked how much money they had made. And they said they weren't sure, but it was approximately $1,500. That was in those days, it was 4 rupees to $1. A huge amount of money that they had collected there. Now it's, what is it, 88 rupees to $1? Well, the rupee was much stronger then, and the dollar was, it was so much money, $1,500. Half audibly, he chanted in the back seat of the car, looking out the window as quiet and unassuming as a child, with no indication that the night before he had been cheered and applauded by thousands of hippies who had stood back and made a grand aisle for him to walk in triumph across the strobe-lit floor amid the thunder of the electric basses and pounding drums of the Avalon ballroom. That was Prabhupada in his humility. When Prabhupada was on the Jaladuta, he wrote in his poem that, "My dear Lord, I don't know why you have brought me to this Ugrastan, to this horrible place. But if you want me to, I'm just like a puppet in your hands. And if you want me to dance, then make me dance, make me dance, make me dance." And here was Prabhupada now, dancing and getting the whole rest of the world to dance along with him. Now, for those of you who don't know, electric basses are electric guitars, and they have a very low sound to them, and they make that very low sound in electric music. So they use that. They were even using it during the Kirtan, because the band players, they took up their instruments and they joined Prabhupada while he was singing. For all of the fanfare of the night before, he remained untouched, the same as ever in personal demeanor. He was aloof, innocent, and humble, while at the same time appearing very grave and ancient. As Kirtanananda and Hayagriva were aware, Swamiji was not of this world. They knew that he, unlike them, was always thinking of Krishna. So this particular picture, Roger Siegel, who became Guru Das, who married Jamuna, he was a photographer. That's why you'll see so many pictures at that time, because Guru Das was there taking photos. So this was the first formal photo that Srila Prabhupada took, that the devotees could worship on the altar, where Prabhupada was sitting properly and his full body form was there with his feet visible there. So Guru Das took this picture at that time. Not exactly this time, but it was during the San Francisco time that this picture was taken of Prabhupada. They walked with him along the boardwalk, near the ocean, with its cool breezes and cresting waves. Kirtanananda spread the chadar over Prabhupada's shoulders. Now Prabhupada says, In Bengali there is one nice verse, Prabhupada remarked, breaking his silence. I remember, oh, what is that voice across the sea, calling, calling? Come here, come here. Speaking little, he walked the boardwalk with his two friends, frequently looking out at the sea and sky. As he walked, he softly sang a mantra that Kirtanananda and Hayagriva had never heard before. So we have to remember that Srila Prabhupada, he grew up in Calcutta, so he was familiar with the Bay of Bengal, all of the storms that came in, and the expanse of the ocean or the sea, the Bay of Bengal, how it seemed to be limitless. And then, as Prabhupada decided to take his trip to America, he had to cross the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean. Now Prabhupada was on the other side of America, and he was now walking along the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest ocean in the whole world. Pacific because it's a lot more peaceful, because it's so big, so massive. As Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, of bodies of water, I am the ocean. So now Prabhupada is going to introduce a new mantra to the devotees. Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya Jaya Radha Ramana Hari Govinda Jaya Jaya. So Prabhupada had never sung that before. Now, being inspired by the peacefulness and the calling of the ocean, he sang out this mantra. He sang slowly in a deep voice as they walked along the boardwalk. He looked out at the Pacific Ocean. Because it is great, it is tranquil. The ocean seems to be eternal, Hayagriva ventured. No, Prabhupada replied, nothing in the material world is eternal. In New York, since there were so few women present at the temple, people had inquired whether it were possible for a woman to join the Krishna consciousness movement. But in San Francisco, that question never arose. Most of the men who came to learn from Swamiji came with their girlfriends. To Prabhupada, these boys and girls, eager for chanting and hearing about Krishna, were like sparks of faith to be fanned into steady, blazing fires of devotional life. There was no question of his asking the newcomers to give up their girlfriends or boyfriends. And yet he uncompromisingly preached no illicit sex. The dilemma, however, seemed to have an obvious solution. Marry the couples in Krishna consciousness. So Srila Prabhupada had that same dilemma in New York, but he only made one marriage there at that time, and that was the marriage between Michael Grant and his girlfriend Jan, who had been living together nearby Srila Prabhupada's apartment in the Bowery. So when Michael or Mukunda found the 26 Second Avenue temple, and soon after that, Srila Prabhupada offered initiation to the devotees who had been studying with him, both Michael and Jan wanted to take initiation. So Jan was the first and the only of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, women at that time, and she received the name Janaki. And Prabhupada encouraged them to get married because they were living together. And one of the principles they were going to have to follow was no illicit sex. Now, Srila Prabhupada's principles were very strict, and we follow those principles as grihastas, as Prabhupada's disciples. That is, complete celibacy, no sex whatsoever, even in marriage, unless one wants to conceive a child. And even at that time, when you want to conceive a child, you have to find out the most opportune time when the woman is fertile, and only one time in the month is the husband and wife allowed to have sexual relations. So the husbands and the wives, if they were following their vows strictly, would be equally as celibate as the brahmacharis. There would be no sex unless they wanted to conceive a child. So far there were no children in Krishna consciousness because Mukunda and Janaki didn't have any children. So now Prabhupada realized, now that he was on the West Coast, which was much more promiscuous than the East Coast, the girls and the boys were all living together in communes, and the boys came with their girlfriends, the girls had their boys, everything. They all came together to Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada couldn't separate them. It was part of the culture. So he decided to carry this forward and get them married. Because traditionally a sannyasi would never arrange or perform marriages, by Indian standards, someone might criticize Prabhupada for allowing any mingling of the sexes. So you'll see in other temples here, there's no such thing as what we have here in our temples. The wonderful kirtans that we have, there's no distinction. And sometimes the women will be on one side, the men will be on the other side. But there's no real rules. Everyone is chanting and dancing together. It's the culture here that when you have kirtan, everyone is invited to take part in kirtan. But Prabhupada, he wanted his disciples to follow the four regulative principles strictly. And the only way he was going to legalize this boyfriend-girlfriend relationship was to get them married. So he had to overstep being a sannyasi and having nothing to do with women anymore, although he had been a married man with daughters and a wife. Now he realized he was going to have to get his disciples and his followers married. And they didn't know how to perform marriages, so he was going to have to perform the marriages for them. What Indian, however critical, but Prabhupada gave priority to spreading Krishna consciousness. What Indian, however critical, had ever tried to transplant the essence of India's spiritual culture into the Western culture? Prabhupada saw that to change the American social system and completely separate the men from the women would not be possible. But to compromise his standard of no illicit sex was also not possible. So we'll see here, this is a marriage certificate that was created. State of California, City and Country of San Francisco. I hereby certify that on July 13th, 1967, at the Radha Krishna Temple, California, under the authority of license issued by the county clerk of the County of San Francisco, I, the undersigned, as a Hindu Swami Reverend, joined in marriage Jean Campanella and Roger Siegel in the presence of Janaki Devi Dasi, residing at 512 Frederick Street, and California, in San Francisco, California, and Mukunda Das Adhikari, residing at 512 Frederick Street, signed A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. So Prabhupada was getting his disciples legally married. This is the marriage certificate of Jamuna and Gurudas. Now Prabhupada had a system for our marriages. Those of us who were married by Srila Prabhupada, he said first you had to take initiation. Why? Because you had to take your vows. And one of those vows is no illicit sex. So before you even get married, you have to become a disciple and take your vow that you won't have illicit sex. Then after initiation, you get legally married. That's all upside down now. You get the legal marriage because Prabhupada wanted everything to be done legally. You get your legal marriage. After the legal marriage, when you see that you will be able to live together as husband and wife, and you'll be able to take your vows, because once you take your vow in front of the fire, that's a very serious thing, because you're taking a vow in front of the Supreme Lord. Legally, one can be divorced, right? You can just go to the court and say this marriage is untenable, it's not working anymore, and you get divorced. So after your legal marriage, then you can get your fire sacrifice in the temple, where you have the witness of the fire, of the deities, and of the Vaishnavas. And then you take your vows that you will never be separated. So that was the proper way that Prabhupada had us get married. And we would take permission from Srila Prabhupada before getting married. We would write and ask permission. Prabhupada would make sure we were both initiated. Then he would give his blessings, and then the marriage would take place in the temple amongst the devotees. If possible, Prabhupada himself would perform the marriage. If he wasn't there, then another senior devotee would perform the marriage. For instance, Gurudas performed our marriage, my marriage, because he was on his way to Vrindavan here. He came to our temple, performed the marriage. At that time, he told us to come to Vrindavan and help open the temple. And that's how we came to Vrindavan, from that marriage ceremony. So, therefore, Krishna conscious married life, the Grihastha ashram, would be the best arrangement for many of his new aspiring disciples. In Krishna consciousness, husband and wife could live together and help one another in spiritual progress. It was an authorized arrangement for allowing a man and woman to associate. If, as spiritual master, he found it necessary to perform marriages himself, he would do it. But first, these young couples would have to become attracted to Krishna consciousness, because the hippies didn't get married because it meant responsibility. And even many of the children who were married to these hippie couples, what type of a family life did they have? It was very unsure. But Prabhupada, he was going to change all of that. He was going to make a Vedic system that his disciples, they would have to make a commitment in their marriage, they would have to raise their children in Krishna consciousness, and they would have to become very dedicated preachers. The husband and wife, they were partners together. Not only were they husband and wife, they were god brother and god sister. And like two tracks Prabhupada described it, like two tracks on a train track, the husband and the wife. And what is the train? The instructions of the spiritual master moving forward. So whenever Prabhupada would initiate the devotees and get them married, once they were married, he would send them out to open up temples all over the world. These are the pictures of Gurudas and Jamuna's wedding. Joan Campanella had grown up in a wealthy suburb of Portland, Oregon, where her father was a corporate tax attorney. She and her sister had had their own sports cars and their own boats for sailing on Lake Oswego. Now, because my daughter lives in Portland, the most posh, top-class place in Portland is this Lake Oswego, that's where all the rich people live. There's a big lake, and you have boats, and They had their own boats for sailing on the lake, their own sports cars. So they came from a very wealthy background, as did many of Srila Prabhupada's disciples. But they gave it all up to serve Srila Prabhupada. Disgusted with the sorority life at the University of Oregon, Joan had dropped out during her first term and enrolled at Reed College, where she had studied ceramics, weaving, and calligraphy. Calligraphy is a special type of, you see here this special type of writing that's done? That's called calligraphy. In 1963, she had moved to San Francisco and become the co-owner of a ceramic shop. Although she had then had many friends among fashionable shopkeepers, folk singers, and dancers, she had remained aloof and introspective. It was through her sister Jan that Joan had first met Srila Prabhupada. We read about all of this in Volume 2, when Joan came for the wedding. Jan had gone with her boyfriend Michael Grant to live in New York City, where Michael had worked as a music arranger. In 1965, they had met Swamiji while he was living alone on the Bowery, and they had become his initiated disciples, Mukunda and Janaki. Swamiji had asked them to get married, and they had invited Joan to the wedding. As a wedding guest for one day, Joan had then briefly entered Swamiji's transcendental world at 26 2nd Avenue, and he had kept her busy all day making dough and filling kachori pastries for the wedding feast. Joan had worked in one room, and Swamiji had worked in the kitchen, although he had repeatedly come in and guided her in making the kachoris properly. Prabhupada had made potato kachoris that day. He had made the filling and gave her the dough. He taught her that the dough had to be like the earlobe, like that. And then she was filling the kachoris, and Prabhupada was doing all the cooking, the frying in the kitchen, telling her not to touch her clothes or body while cooking and instructing her not to smoke cigarettes. While she was rolling the dough and making the kachori, she asked Prabhupada if she could go smoke a cigarette. Because the food was to be offered to Lord Krishna and therefore had to be prepared purely. Joan had been convinced by this brief association that Swamiji was a great spiritual teacher, but she had returned to San Francisco without pursuing Krishna consciousness further. A few months later, Mukunda and Janaki had driven to the West Coast with plans of going soon to India, but had changed their plans when Mukunda had received a letter from Swamiji asking him to try to start a Krishna-conscious temple in California. Mukunda had talked about Swamiji to Joan and other friends, and he had found that a lot of young people were interested. Joan had then accompanied Mukunda, Janaki, and a boy named Roger Siegel to the mountains in Oregon, where they had visited their mutual friends, Sam and Marjorie, who had been living in a forest lookout tower. So that's a lookout tower up there. They would climb the stairs, and they lived in that tower up there. And they had to look over 1,000 square miles of forest and make sure that there were no forest fires. Because in Oregon, because there's so many trees there, if there's one small, let's say by accident, someone starts a fire and that spark goes under the leaves, and after they leave, it starts smoke coming up. So from the tower, they can see that smoke, where it's coming up from, and they can race there and stop the fire. Otherwise, hundreds and hundreds of miles of forest can be destroyed by a forest fire. So that's where Sam and Marjorie lived, up in that cabin there. And Joan, Jan, Mukunda, and Roger went to see them to convince them to come with them to San Francisco to open the temple there. So it's after 7 o'clock now. We'll continue next week. Hare Krishna. Jai. There they all are.